Thanks a lot. Thanks for a very inspiring report, and thanks also for very inspiring speeches beforehand. I was particularly struck by the keynote speech by Weiler, and I felt that my presentation now is probably not going to please him, because I am neither an academic nor a politician, but in between a stock taker. And that's probably not for his taste. But I would say that it's interesting what we are doing at European level in many senses. And I would say that while my presentation today is focusing on the governance framework in relationship to employment, the policy agenda is clearly changing at European level. We had earlier this year the so-called Paris Declaration, which recognizes and supports the fact that education is much more than employment, and other competences are coming to the fore, and these are competences that we will be interested and in exploring further in our future work. My presentation today will focus briefly, it will be very brief, first on the work of Eurydice. Secondly, how we are looking at the issue of employment and what kind of governance structure that we are trying to capture in our analysis. And then finally, I will give 3 brief examples of the kind of work we are doing. I would say we are probably most known in the field of higher education for the so-called Bologna implementation report. It's quite a heavy volume, so I haven't been able to bring more than 1 copy, but I have put a number of Eurydice briefs on the modernization agenda and on modernization of higher education, the report on access, retention and employability on the table, so you are more than welcome to take a copy when you leave. So I start by mentioning the Eurydice network. So this network is one of the first creations in the educational field. It's from 1980. It celebrated its 35th anniversary earlier this year. And it's a network that is responsible for providing advice and information to support decision-making at European level. The network it doesn't cover as many countries as the Bologna process. The Bologna process is 48 countries, but we cover 37 countries and have 41 national units. My unit is in the center of it all. We are using the information that member states provide to us to provide comparative analysis of state of play of policies, regulations, strategies, and so forth at national level. We do this in a policy process at European level. So the Council, the Commission agrees on common EU objectives, benchmarks in the field of education. They have adopted policy frameworks in many different areas: early childhood education and care, higher education, early leaving from education and training. And there's a policy process, the open method of coordination, whereby the Council, the Commission provides guidance to member states through the so-called country-specific recommendations. Member states, you know that the educational field is a national competence. Member states are obviously free to consider that advice and take it into account in their policy process. They are not obliged to do so. It's policy advice. But what we do, and our role in this process, is to take stock. What is actually happening at member states? How are member states reacting to these overall policy frameworks? What kind of initiatives are they taking? And we produce, in relationship to all these frameworks, stock-taking reports. These reports can obviously be used in the policy process to further identify gaps, challenges, and feed into a new policy circle. So I move to the issue of today, namely employability, graduate employability, and how we are analyzing this issue at or in Eurydice publications. So we look at it from 3 different angles. First of all, we look at the demand side. How is labor market information brought into the higher education system? And we look principally at 2 different methodologies. First of all, labor market forecasting. Are member states forecasting skill needs, demands for specific skills, or are they not? Another issue that we are looking at is to what extent do employers have an impact in terms of the decision-making processes at the higher education institutions? Are employers involved in curricular development, in teaching? And how do they engage with the higher education institutions in view of bringing labor market information into the development of programs and so forth? The second angle that we are looking at is the supply side to a certain extent. How do the higher education institutions try to enhance the graduates' employability? So, do member states ensure that higher education institutions provide career guidance for their students? And to what extent do students at universities take part in practical training and work placement? And the final issue that we're looking at is monitoring and evaluation in terms of graduate tracking surveys. How are institutions and member states looking into the graduates coming out of the system? So how do we look at that? We look at that by analyzing the information that we receive from our national units, and we provide graphical displays like this. So in terms of involvement of employers in higher education institutions' governing bodies, what we see is that there is a formal requirement for employers to be involved in the higher education institutions' governing bodies in the majority of countries. However, it's also clear that in some countries, notably in Germany, the Netherlands, Turkey, for instance, Greece, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Croatia, this is not a formal requirement to include employers in the governing bodies of education institutions. Another issue that we are looking at, and that's related to my second point, namely the supply side. What do higher education institutions provide in terms of career guidance? And we see that most higher education institutions are obliged to provide career guidance. But when we analyze it further, we can also see that generally students from underrepresented groups are not targeted in these career guidance systems. And research says that it is in particular these underrepresented groups, particularly students coming from low socioeconomic backgrounds, that should be targeted in these career guidance services. And we can see that, that this is not the case. That in the majority of countries, there's career guidance, but it's not for underrepresented groups and students from low socioeconomic backgrounds. My final graph is on my final display is on the third and final issue that we're looking at in relationship to employability. That's the tracking of graduates after they have graduated from a institution. And what we can see is that few countries actually use this information systematically at national level to develop and provide input to their higher education institutions. It's not used systematically, and when it's used, it's mainly used in terms of quality assurance and in providing information, institutional information on how graduates are doing following their studies. So, in conclusion, we can see that all EU countries obviously engage in improving the employability of their graduates. We can also see that there's a very different focus on demand-side information. How do we integrate information from the labor market in the governing and programming of higher education? We can see that when we are talking about guidance services, that it targets all students, but the most disadvantaged students have not a particular focus within the guidance service. And what we also note is that in terms of monitoring, it's clear that a lot of information is collected, but it's not used systematically in terms of providing evidence-based policymaking. That's my conclusion. I have a reference here, publicity, for a number of the reports that deal with higher education. So if you are interested in getting to know more about the work of Eurydice in this field, then you are invited to take a look at our webpage or pick up a report over there.
Thank you very much.